I'm going to do a little bit of, just to try to, I'm actually sorry, I'm going to wait another 30 seconds. Okay, hi. So I'm going to, thanks again to all of you for coming. Those of you joining us for the first time, I'm going to try to do, I guess, a little bit of a summary of kind of the direction that we've been taking. We've been largely focused on the Rambam in his Shmona Prakim and what he understands to be the role of Midot, Tikkun HaMidot, working on personal character. Going back to the Rambam, because there's certain ways in which the Rambam, although he's 800, 900 years old, is psychologically attuned in a way that's unique and different than lots of other texts that we read. What we focused on in the first class was to try to show how the Rambam believes that ki nefesh ha'adam achati, that a person has one nefesh through which the Rambam tries to explain that he does not think about the person as being, we associate the nefesh with the neshama, and we often have a dualistic kind of understanding of these things, where one side of us is spiritual and one side of us is material or physical, and they're battling it out, and that might be the Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, and one side is supposed to suppress the other. The Rambam is a much more unified and harmonious way of thinking about things. The nefesh is actually more like the psyche or the personality of the person, and the person's responsibility is to then figure out how to drive all of those forces in a certain kind of way. Last week we focused on the idea of the Rambam's adopting of Aristotle's golden mean with some shifts, and the way that he makes that kind of central to Jewish life, by which he says that for the Rambam, if I go back to the first time again, the first round, in a dualistic model, you generally imagine that the intellect is trying to kind of suppress or overcome the irrational. There's a rational side, an irrational side. The emotions are the irrational side. Intellect is the rational side, and those two are the warring things. Rambam won't have any of that, as the Greeks didn't have any of that. He believes that the cognition and emotion are very entangled, and that the way that you experience things has a lot to do with the way you understand what's happening to you, and that and which we can associate with circumstances, things, sometimes small things that get us very angry. For example, kind of road rage is always the example in my head, that you should be able to train, why do I react this way to that circumstance? We often say, again, I think it's a pretty modern-ish, we're moving out of it again, but it's a pretty modern-ish kind of idea that I can't help how I feel. What I do about it is what's really important. And the Rambam would say, actually, you can help how you feel, and you're supposed to work on that, and that's part of what training the Midot is about. The last things that we were doing last time were focused on what that means for the Rambam's understanding of what it means to be an observant Jewish person, a shomer mitzvot. The Rambam believes that mitzvot align with this derech emtzai, this middle road, and that what the mitzvot are there for is to train us in certain regards to be able to strike a proper balance. And because that's what mitzvot are about, that means that it's not just the performance of the actions, and it's not just about the obedience part of it. It's actually about developing certain dispositions, which means that alongside this constant, the observance, there has to be a constant monitoring, engaging, how am I doing, how am I managing my various emotions, appetites, and drives, and that impacts on what I eat, how I take care of my body, a person's sexual life, person's emotional life. All of that is part of what mitzvot are trying to train. So that's kind of a summary. I'd like to do for today focus on one piece to finish off that chunk and then move to something else. So the Rambam is, I will start on page 1 at the top. Last time we were focused on the fourth parak of the Rambam Shmona Prakim, so we're going to do a last part of these Shmona Prakim. Are there any other sheets, sources around someplace? No, thank you. Thanks. So the first paragraph here is a summary, then it's going to move to the next thing. Well, the Rambam is very committed to his middle of the road. As I said, he makes it Jewish by connecting it to mitzvot and how that is supposed to work. He also doesn't believe that it's true in every circumstance. So let's start here. First paragraph is a little bit of a summary. He says, from all that we have stated in this chapter, it is evident that it is man's duty to aim at performing acts that observe the proper mean, and not to desist from them by going to one extreme or the other. So just as he who, acquainted with the science of medicine, upon noting the least sign of a change for the worse in his health, does not remain indifferent to it, but prevents the sickness from increasing to a degree that will require recourse to violent remedies, and just as when a man, feeling that one of his limbs has become affected, carefully nurses it, refraining from things that are injurious to it, and applying every remedy that will restore it to its healthy condition, or at least keep it from getting worse. Likewise, all of that is the medical, this is what we do in taking care of our body. Likewise, the moral man will constantly examine his characteristics, weigh his deeds, and daily investigate his psychic condition. And I think it's important to think about all of those, because sometimes you think about, well, characteristics, I should be patient and kind and that kind of thing. Deeds, I should keep Shabbos and Kashrus and make sure that I daven every day. A daily investigate a psychic condition kind of gives you a sense that all of this is a certain unified force in a way in which we sometimes bifurcate. It's not like about religion and being a good guy. It's not what's going on in my mind, what kind of character I have, how observant I am, are all intertwined into what kind of person I am, and that requires daily investigation. And if at any time he finds his soul deviating to one extreme or another, he will immediately hasten to apply the proper remedy. Philosophers tell us it is most difficult and rare to find a man who by his nature is endowed with every perfection, moral as well as mental. Solomon says of mankind in general, for no man is so righteous upon earth that he should do always good and never sin. That is a commonly quoted pasuk, and almost the reason why I wanted to cite this part of what the Rambam was describing is because our tendency is when we read that kind of phrase to think about it as sinning against God, like aveirot and mitzvot, and it's important to stress the way in which what the Rambam means to be a chet here means being literally a chet means missing the mark, like la'achti hamatara, and what the Rambam is actually pointing to is the way in which you can be missing the mark of what I'm supposed to be and the life I'm supposed to lead, not only because I am not performing a mitzvah, I'm doing an aveira, but because my psychic dispositions, the way that I'm living my life, the way that I'm managing myself and my body, interacting with those, all of those things have not yet been perfected and therefore require work. Okay. So far, that's more or less kind of aspects of stuff that we've talked about before. Then the Rambam goes on to something which I remember when I think the first year that I was teaching years ago, my first role was teaching 10th grade Chumash Sefer Bamidbar, and I was teaching Chet. I was teaching the Chet of Mei Meriva. What happened with Moshe at the rock, and the problem that basically what happened there was cost Moshe his the ultimate goal of his entire life to enter into Eretz Yisrael didn't come to be because of what happened there. And when you learn it from a Chumash side, it's like, okay, we're going to read through the story. What's the problem with what Moshe did? And there are lots of suggestions. Rashi has his, the Ramban has his kind of response to Rashi. There's a lot of back and forth around that. And then after you do all that kind of textual analysis, what you do is there's a Rambam. This is the Rambam, which comes from kind of left field, which when I was learning from a Chumash perspective, I thought was, how did this... It didn't kind of register in the narrative so much from the way that we showed him analyze the psukim, but over the years it's become I find like a remarkable explanation. Rambam basically says, what was Moshe Rabbeinu's sin at Mei Meriva? That he got angry. Most of the Mefarshim say God said things like, God said speak to the rock and he hit the rock. Or then the Ramban says, well, if he said, speak to the rock. Why did he say kacha tamateh? Well, he must have had to hit the rock once, and he actually hit the rock twice. Like that. The Ram says his sin was that he got angry, and that's and how does that, where does he say that? In this context is where he describes it, and we showed him, we'll quote it, but it's worth kind of reading and then unpacking in terms of how the Rambam thinks about the midot, because apparently, if it's true that every midah you have to find the middle way, people can't be perfect, and you got to find this. Here we have Moshe Rabbeinu who got angry, and that was the end. Rambam takes that very seriously. Let's read it inside, and we'll talk about it a little more. Rambam says, "You know also that God said to our teacher Moses, the master of former and later ages, because you have not confided in me to sanctify me, because you rebelled against my order at the waters of Meribah, because you did not sanctify me." These are all quotes from the pasuk. All of this, God said, although the sin of Moses consisted merely in that he departed from the moral mean of patience to the extreme of wrath, insofar as he exclaimed, "Hear now, you rebels, Shimuna Hamorim." Meaning for the Rambam, the sin was that they were trying his patience so much that he lashed out at them and said, "Shimuna, listen, Hamorim, you rebellious people." And that was enough of a violation that was the end. I'm wondering actually how this kind of strikes you, and I guess I split. Does it make sense, or it sounds like, well, that's pretty harsh that should be like what's Moshe's? I actually find it very humanizing in a certain sense. Let's finish the paragraph. He says, "Yet for this God found fault with him, that such a man as he should show anger in the presence of the entire community of Israel, where wrath is unbecoming. This was a profanation of God's name because men imitated the words and conduct of Moses, hoping thereby to attain temporal and eternal happiness. How could he then allow his wrath free play, since it is a pernicious characteristic arising, as we have shown, from an evil psychic condition?" What do you make of this? What was his big sin, Moshe? That he was human. For that, you can't go into Israel because you're a human? Meaning, right, yes, but...
I mean, look at, I leave it down and listen to everybody else.
Okay.
It's a
Yeah.
human characteristic that you push somebody so far that at the end they crack.
And is that and why did he deserve such punishment for that, would you say? That's sort of push. Yeah. Okay.
Because he was a role
It
model.
seems because he was a role model for the people, and that they would, repeat his actions.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of a humanizing of the story that actually I find like really striking. It's not about follow God's. It's almost like this. The way Rambam interprets the story is an example of the way the Rambam interprets everything. It's like it's not about like the obedience and the non-obedience. And you make the miracle happen, you not make the miracle happen. Look at the scene. Moshe is the leader of Am Yisrael. Basically, as a leader, there's a certain something that you need in order to be able to manage the people. Moshe got angry, and in Moshe's getting angry, he lost his. It's almost like it was a natural consequence. It's like you can't serve as the leader when you're getting angry at the people who then aren't going to be able to. Now, Parshanim, when the interpreters of the Rambam of the text don't like this Rambam because it's like where actually do you get it from? And I actually find it to be like very remarkable and powerful. Meaning you have to. It fits into the Rambam's understanding of Torah in general, which is it's not just about obedience. It's actually about cultivating certain dispositions. And actually, as the leader, you have an obligation to cultivate those dispositions most significantly because the ramifications are that much more significant, so much so that Moshe lost the opportunity to go into Israel, maybe according to this, because it's almost like a natural consequence. It was like not a punishment. It's almost, that's where you need to be. Now, will you say that's harsh? Maybe. That just might be the way that it is in terms of what God wanted for the leader. Yes?
I have a question. Didn't Moshe break the glucose out of anger? Why would this be any worse than breaking the glucose when he came down and saw him with the
there are. I mean, that's a good. I'm going to skirt because there are lots of different explanations as to how exactly that the lucho. Did he do it? Did he do it intentionally? Or did it kind of slip out of his hands or something? So maybe. It's.
He thought it would lead to Avodah Zarah.
He's. I don't want to. I mean, basically, my response to you is that there are different ways of understanding that story. A and B. I'm less interested in this for now in terms of the explanation of the story. We're not learning the Chumash part, and actually, it's the Rambam brings this in Shmona Prakim. The idea, as far as we're concerned, is to just stress the significance of the character trait and how important it is to the Rambam that what Moshe did wrong in not going to Israel was not violating God's word. If the point here in the Rambam's whole approach is the doing God's word, not doing the mitzvah, is not primarily about the obedience to God. It's about cultivating certain dispositions. That mitzvot, you need the observance in order to cultivate, but it's about cultivating those dispositions. It makes it that much more kind of striking that's how he's thinking about it, that Moshe's ultimate sin was not actually about violating something God told him. It was just about not being able to carry himself in the way that he needed to, according to what God's expectation was in that setting. So for us, and I'm going to move past this now, it's the intertwining again of mitzvah and psychic disposition and the ways in which those work together that the Rambam is so committed to, both in terms of his understanding of mitzvot and also in terms of his understanding of the narratives, the story, which he's actually doing as well. Which leads him to, I just wanted to read the last couple of halachot. This is in Hilchot Dead Perek Bet. This is in Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam says, actually there are, I use this as I just want to use this as a segue to take note. The Rambam says, Yesh de'ot shasulo la'adam linhog behem bebeinonit. We spent the last hour talking about how the Rambam believes that everything should be the middle of the road, that golden mean, and that the mitzvot are there to train that. And he says, that's always true. And after he says that's always true, he says, except there actually is one place, or maybe two places, where that's not true. Ela yitrachek ara katzeh ha'acher, but you have to go to the opposite extreme. The first one is gova halev. Arrogance. Arrogance is an example, the Rambam says, where you're obligated to go to the opposite, to the other extreme. She'ein derech hatova sheyeh ha'adam anav bilvad. It's not enough to be humble. El sheyeh shval ruach. You have to be really humble. And you have to err on the side of not saying like, well, what's the middle of the road, kind of. You should say to yourself, I actually want to be careful to err on the side of being more humble than the middle. Why? Lefikach ne'amar b'Moshe Rabbeinu. How does he know this is true? And it's striking that the two deviations from the golden mean he takes from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is called, he is anav me'od, he is anav mikol adam, he is the most humble. V'lo ne'amar anav bilvad. It doesn't just say he's humble, it says he was extremely humble. He was the most humble of all people. Which parenthetically is important to note that he said that does not mean that humility means thinking, right, less of. In school here we like to quote this line from C.S. Lewis all the time. He has a lot of sharp lines, and on this humility topic. So he says, if I get it right, he says humility doesn't mean thinking of yourself less. I'm sorry. It doesn't. I always get it backwards. It doesn't mean thinking less of yourself. It means thinking of yourself less, by which he means to say, you're not supposed to think that you're less than you are. You're just not supposed to think of yourself all the time. You're supposed to realize that there's something that's bigger than you. If you put that into the context of, again, what God wants from us, what it means to be a community leader, Moshe Rabbeinu, all of that. Moshe Rabbeinu is a leader. He wasn't humble in a way in which he didn't realize the power that he had. But he had to be anav mikol adam, and in the last line of this Rambam he says, "Od amru shekol amadbia libo kafar biikar." It's actually heresy. Arrogance is heresy. Shene'emar v'ram levavcha v'shachachta Hashem Elokecha. Arrogance leads to forgetting God. And I Same kind of thing. I guess I'm wondering how, how you hear it. The Rambam says with everything, it's important to be able to find that middle of the road, but that being a connection to God mandates humility, and arrogance is the opposite of
Absolute.
that. That's because I mean, think of the idea of even that very first step of recognizing that there's something bigger than me. Arrogance gets in the way of that, and humility allows for the space for that to be. So it's again, I'll say, interesting how the Rambam is so careful. He's signed on to this golden mean, but he's also reading the Chumash, and he's bringing these things together the way that he can. So the golden mean, that's always good. But Moshe is anav me'od. That means there, the golden mean doesn't apply. There you have to be more humble than the norm. Then a second example is v'chein haka'as, l'chavod. Anger, same thing. Deyara hi ad me'od. That's very problematic. So this connects, although he doesn't connect it here, but connects to what he said in Shemona Prakim. V'ra'ui la'adam shitrachek men ad hakatzeh ha'acher. You have to go to the opposite extreme in terms of anger, which and he's going to spell it out. Yilamed atzmo shelo yichos. You have to teach yourself, and again I want to emphasize his formulations because he does believe that you can teach these things, teach yourself these things, and that goes back to what you're talking about, that practice, having a teacher, self-diagnosis, all those kinds of things are part of what the Rambam is arguing for in terms of cultivating that. And then he says, "Va'afilu al davar she'ra'ui l'chos alav." Now you'll say, we learned that you have to have the middle of the road because it's never good to be at an extreme. How can you not get angry? There's some things you have to get angry. If you see an injustice, you have to get angry. And the Rambam says, yes, but let me tell you how you do that. He says, "Im ratzah lahatil eima al banav u'bnei beito." It is appropriate to be matil eima. That means to instill the fear of God in your kids, because there's sometimes where you say, like, don't you ever do that. Is there a time for you to, like, speak in those terms? The Rambam says, if there's a midah beinonit, there's a midah beinonit here too. You need to know how to, and it doesn't always mean being, so I should say that, I don't know if I said that. It doesn't always mean doing the same thing down the middle. That's not what being in the middle of the road means. It means different circumstances demand different kinds of responses, and you need to be able to evaluate the circumstances and determine the responses. However, when it comes to anger, even when you want to do that, or if you are a communal leader and you want to give your community some mussar or speak to them about an issue, and you want to give them some mussar so that they'll change their ways. You have to make it look, you have to perform your anger, but the Ram actually believes that you're not supposed to experience that anger. Now, I don't think that the Ram will say he never experienced, we can kind of talk this out, because the Rambam, I think he's serious, and you can say, what, how's that possible? And the Rambam thinks, we're going to see at the end, that perfection in all of these things is what it means to be a Navi. So it's not like he thinks that we can all achieve this. He's just saying that we're supposed to be kind of working towards that. He says, Tiyeh da'ato miyushevet beino lebein atzmo. Internally, you have to have a dayah miyushevet. That means what you're experiencing inside, what you should be striving for, is striving for an inner peace through which you can manage the circumstances that are happening around you. And in a case of anger, it's ke'adam shehu midameh ish bishat kaso. It's you're behaving like an angry person, bu'eno koes, but you're not actually angry. To sum up, basically, the Rambam is a believer in this middle of the road, which means managing every circumstance and gauging it and knowing when you did well, when you didn't do well. That's what it means to be healthy and ill. The middle of the road applies in all cases. The two places where it doesn't apply is one case where Moshe is praised for it, and one case where Moshe got in the biggest trouble of his life for it. Humility and anger, where in both of those cases, arrogance cuts against what it means to recognize kind of the bigger picture. and anger gets in the way. I mean, I experience it as one is a kind of a vertical and one is a horizontal. What's the biggest issue when it comes to being able to be an Oved Hashem, like the arrogance what gets in the way? What's the biggest issue that gets in the way of being able to meaningfully interact with other people? Anger is the thing that gets most in the way. You can feel free to comment. Yes.
What I'm struggling with is the advocacy for appearing as if you're angry. And I need some help in convincing me that there's a benefit in appearing that you intended to be furious.
I find that an easy one to answer. Sometimes we're raising those children, you know, you have set certain boundaries, and I don't know, you can have an instance where you personally are really not that angry that they've done this sort of act, but you know that there's almost an expectation on their part, and you follow through with it, and you know, if there were means of, you know, saying, you know, there were consequences to the action, you mete those out, and you act in a more angry manner, then you really deep down feel like, okay, you know, you understood the circumstances of what happened, that sort of thing. I mean, I'm thinking of
So, you know, you triggered my special ed administrator, where sometimes a kid would pull off a prank that was so clever, you're chewing on the inside of your...
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Kids too, you're chewing on the inside of your cheek not to crack up, and you're giving them discipline.
Right.
So I'm sorry, you got me, thank you.
I venture to, like, sometimes when I compare, it certainly happens all the time, I think, in a school setting where kids can do something wrong, and you need to lace into them for doing something wrong. It doesn't mean that you need to be angry at them for doing something wrong. You just know that you need to communicate that to them. And actually, you know that if you're angry, it probably backfires, and it's actually more successful if you're able to talk to them not from a point of anger, even if you need to talk to them intensely, which, again, personally, I feel like sometimes when I've reflected back on that to a parenting situation where I think it's more common, I find, to get angry, and then I ask myself why that. Well, it's a certain level of investment, or maybe it's actually investment in, I mean, sometimes I've wondered whether your own, it's like about you, like it becomes too much about you in a way that's, and that if it's about the other person, it's much, if you recognize that it's really about the, I think what I'm trying to say is that having a hard time understanding this Rambam at some point, and then comparing it to the differences sometimes between my kids at home and my kids here, has actually led me to kind of a conclusion that makes this round very interesting, which is that your personal anger sometimes has to do with your own needing something to be a certain kind of way. And that's what the anger is. It's your own humiliation, your own, like, why, how can you do this to me? Which is part of the weakness. It's about, you know, you, somehow that separation allows for a more successful educational exchange. So I find this to be super important in terms of both of these, the humility and the anger. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember in what context I learned it, but I had learned at some point along the way that anger is the equivalent of avodah zarah.
Yeah. Rambam quotes that Gemara too. I didn't bring it. I cut it out. Yeah.
Okay, so that being the case, like, it gives you a greater understanding, because it's really, when you really get angry, it's like you're not yourself.
Yeah.
You are taken over by almost this other force. I mean, and if you look at it that way, I would think that it all makes sense.
It's a foreign body. It's like a
You
yeah.
know, and it's the people closest to you that can trigger that. It's not the student who you have a greater degree of objectivity. So, like, I mean, I think that, you know, when one goes through one's life, you know, you see on the street, people oftentimes behave much better, oddly enough, in public than they do in private.
Yes. Yes. Right. And again, for the Rambam, that not being in control is the number one problem. I mean, that's where all, in each of these instances, like knowing what the circumstance is, which doesn't mean, I just feel like kind of in terms of balancing it, doesn't mean not having pleasure or not having passion or being cold. He's talked about how the balance in all of those circumstances is so important. but you were making the decision is what's really vital. Yes.
Thinking about world events, are there certain things we should be angry about? Should we be angry that a guy, drives his truck through a bike lane and kills people? Should we be angry that a guy walks into a church in Texas and shoots people? Like
Reasonable
should we be angry? And sometimes the opposite of anger is acceptance and complacency.
Yeah. So for 100% of the Rambam believes that there's a place for anger, but I venture to say it's not clear yet that the emotional being taken over by is not a successful form of anger for the Rambam. And and I wonder actually if you actually thought about it, do we think we should be angry about some of the actions that people have done? Yes, but what do we think that means? Does that mean yelling at whom exactly? Getting angry at so I don't even know what we mean when we mean that. I don't think what we mean is have your emotions come up so strongly that you lash out at whoever it is you're sitting with. That's not anger, but actually kind of stating strongly or doing what you can or fighting against or something like that is right. So that's healthy. It's almost that's like sometimes I think you'd say this is Rambam's not saying this. I'd say like you replace the gratification of the emotional response with actually what might be more purposeful, which is not to have an emotional response, like do something, figure out like what the right action is that you're supposed to do. So I think that what the Rambam is pushing for in every single instance, means like every single instance, is our ability to
moderate.
But not be parv. That's not what it means. It means to cultivate our emotional, use the Torah to cultivate our dispositions, to understand how to respond to the varying circumstances in a way that's going to kind of get us the furthest. Okay, that was the end of that's the first half. The last thing that I wanted to do, I'm going to ask you to turn to the page 4, to the end. When we started, I had said that what I would hope that we focus on are this is supposed to be on practicing character at Tikun Amidot. So there was like 2 questions that were 4 questions. The first 2 were, what does it mean to do? What does Tikun Amidot mean? Like, what is it, and how do you do it? That was the first. And the second, which is kind of a religious side of that, is what is its connection to Shmirat HaMitzvot, and what's its connection to Avodat Hashem. So what we've been doing so far, I think, in my head at least, or trying to do, is do the first 3 of those. Like, what is Tikkun Amidot within the Rambam? It is this kind of figuring out how to balance all the stuff that we've been talking about. And the way that you do that is by taking the medical analogy seriously, which means keeping an eye, having a doctor, coach, spiritual leader, monitoring yourself, and lots of practice. Those are the things that you do in order to be able to cultivate those things. What does it have to do with Shmirat HaMitzvot? Everything in that for the Rambam, Shmirat HaMitzvot is about developing those characteristics, which basically means that the mitzvot then are not just about obedience to a divine commander. It's actually God commanded us to do these things so that we would cultivate certain characteristics within ourselves. But then what does that have to do with, what's the Avodat Hashem part? So I want to get to kind of the last thing. Because the Rambam then says, okay, all this in the interest of what? Like, why is it important for me to have kind of these great midot? So the Rambam writes that's his chapter 5 in Mar Nevuchim, and in order to understand, it's actually helpful to read the last segment of the last chapter, the very end of chapter 5 of Shmona Prakim, but we're going to read the last piece of the last chapter of Mar Nevuchim. Rambam wrote Mar Nevuchim 30 years or so after he wrote Shmona Prakim. He wrote his commentary of the Mishnah when he was in his 20s. Commentary of the Mishnah, he was in his 20s. Pretty amazing. And he wrote the Mishnah Torah around 40s. Finished that, and then he finished Mar Nevuchim, and he was about 50. So it's astounding, actually. At the end of Mar Nevuchim, he basically wants to speak to the perfection. He talks about his 4 perfections. He says there are 4 ways in which people can perfect themselves, and he talks about it. One level above the other. And he says like this, we'll read where it says, Book 3, Chapter 54. It says, the ancient and the modern philosophers have shown that man can acquire 4 kinds of perfection. The first kind, the lowest, in the acquisition of which people spend their days, is perfection as regards property. The possession of money, garments, furniture, servants, land, and the like. The possession of the title of a great king belongs to this class. So what's the first perfection? Possession. And his chiddush in the last sentence is that kavod is also a possession. That's which is kind of an interesting thing. It might not be an object, but it's something that you acquire, you're getting from somebody from the outside. That is a perfection, but it's the lowest level of perfection. What makes it the lowest level of perfection? He says in the next sentence, there's no close connection between this possession and its possessor. The reason why it's the lowest perfection is because it's outside of yourself. Your perfection would not be stuff that you have. Your perfection would be stuff that you are, stuff that you become. So what's a level above that? He says the second kind is more closely related to man's body than the first. It includes the perfection of the shape, constitution, and form of man's body, the utmost evenness of temperaments, and the proper order and strength of his limbs. This kind of perfection must likewise be excluded from forming our chief aim, because it is a perfection of the body. Man does not possess it as man. So stop. What's the second perfection? The first perfection is stuff. The second perfection is the body.
Physical.
The physical, right. Now, the reason why that's above is because it's me. The reason why it is not the ultimate aim is because, what does that last line mean? Man does not possess it as man. No, but it's more because you can cultivate it, meaning you can make it perfect. It's not perfect because of, Ram actually is a fan of perfecting, he sees the value in perfecting the body, and that you can take care of it or not take care of it.
But I'm just, I guess I'm thinking too, one is, okay, keeping one's weight and healthy and working out and that sort of thing, and keeping the balance of one's body. And I guess I'm thinking of beauty, that's minashmayim. Either you're gifted with good looks or you're not.
Yeah, that's true. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, when the Rambam talks about, when he means it though as man, he means it as opposed to animal. Meaning it's not distinctive of a human being to have physical properties that are magnificent, that are beautiful. So that's the second. So I hear what you're saying, but he means it in that way.
What is the evenness of temperaments?
Yeah, so evenness of temperaments kind of leans into some of the stuff that we were talking about before, which is like managing, like your appetite, like the different sides, the functioning of your being is actually balanced, kind of in a good kind of way. So it's like your emotion, managing your emotions and stuff like that. You're clear. Yes, it does start to move a little bit in that direction, and I actually don't have a sharp. You're right. I don't have a sharp answer to the question the way that it distinguishes. Because the next one is like he's talking about the temperaments are. I think that what he means is that the temperaments are not quite the next level, but are important in getting to the next level. And so it's kind of a bridge in terms of what you're talking about. I'll read the next thing and see if it makes sense. The third kind of perfection is more closely connected with man himself than the second perfection. It includes moral perfection, the highest degree of excellency in man's character. Okay, so what's a level above that?
Relationship to God, I guess.
Not yet, because that's going to be the fourth. It's a moral. The moral. That distinction is exactly what he wants to point to. What does it mean to be moral? Not what does it mean. It's a vague question. Who does it affect?
Your man-to-man relationship.
Yeah, I mean that's about creating a certain kind of society. And here he says most of the precepts aim at producing this perfection. The first time I read this line, I actually found it was very surprising to me. The precepts means mitzvot. What are most of the mitzvot there for? The Rambam thinks that most mitzvot are there in order to develop a certain kind of society.
Responsibility.
Well, some of it is, remember how he how we learned about it last week. That doesn't just mean giving tzedakah is helpful for the people. It means cultivating dispositions of a certain sort, not not having large kind of appetites for things, being able to keep things in check. That allows for people to interact with each other in a way in which it's actually really it's a way in which you can create the best kind of society that you can kind of possibly create. But he says most of the precepts aim at producing this perfection, but even this kind is only a preparation for another perfection, and it's not sought for its own sake. This actually is important. We're not really going to talk about the next perfection, but I'm going to talk about it, but we're talking about the tikkun. The idea of tikkun hamidot for the Rambam is not allowed to be like the third perfection is to have perfect midot. The third perfection is to have perfect midot. Towards what?
Towards your fellow man.
To what?
Towards your fellow man.
Toward the midot towards your fellow man is all part of the third perfection. That's part of the third, what's not quite kind of at the top, and that's also a preparation for another perfection, and is not sought for its own sake. For all moral principles concern the relation of man to his neighbor. The perfection of man's moral principles is, as it were, given to man for the benefit of mankind, meaning creating a just society is not the end result for the Rambam. That's a great thing. The highest perfection, and I want to introduce it, but actually I don't want to talk about it too much. I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. The fourth kind of perfection is the true perfection of man, the possession of the highest intellectual faculties, the possession of such notions which lead to true metaphysical opinions as regards God. That means wisdom for the Rambam is the highest level, is the highest perfection. I'm only going to note, this is a whole separate conversation which I want to get into. There's a big debate in the Rambam in his last lines of Or Nevuchim whether this 3 and 4 becomes like cyclical, or is the highest perfection really knowledge, or the highest perfection is knowledge, which then feeds back into society, which then feeds back. I don't really care about that right now, and I know that this kind of feels like an abstract idea a little bit. The part that I wanted to just point to is that for the Rambam, the idea of why you do stuff, why you do things, towards what end, is actually very, very important. Meaning, if you kind of start to get into the zone of his hierarchy, like the people value having things. Okay, having things is a perfection, it's lowest level. We might think actually that having things, I don't know what people think, but it was interesting to me that perfecting your body is on a higher level than the health, whatever, that kind of thing is important enough to him. Then being a good person, like whatever those good midot are, that's really important. But even that is supposed to be, there's a little trigger, a little reflex that people are supposed to have, that when they're doing the things that they're doing, like why am I doing this? That's what it means to be an Oved Hashem. Like the idea of being an Oved, I'm doing it for God, that, and please tell me if this, like, I just want to try to concretize the thing a little bit. I mean, it's an abstraction still, but at least to make it, we said, what does it mean to be a Jew, be a good person? Well, no, that's not it. Actually, we need to be, sometimes you have this kind of dichotomy, like, what? To be a Jew means to do God's mitzvah and to serve God. No, that's not what it means. To be a good Jew means to be a good person, because that's actually really what God wants from us. Do you know what I mean by that binary? I sometimes feel like within our community, even, we have like those two different tugs. Like the tug that says that, it's all about me being a good Jew, right? And that, or you guys, that's all like, it's all like fromaki, whatever. It's really just about being a good person, and that's it. So I guess what I want to convey is how, while the Rambam is so, I think, psychologically attuned and trying to push us to really work on ourselves very hard in terms of all these things, he says what you need to do is, though, recognize why you're doing that, which is in your head you have to be saying, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I believe there's a God in the world that actually is asking something of me. That's why I'm doing it. So I thought the perfections would be helpful, not for abstraction reasons, but just to be able to read some of the other things that he says. So you can turn back to page 3. We'll read a little and then you can comment. I'm gonna go a little bit out of order here. From this point of view, where the paragraph starts, he says on page 3, from this point of view, the study of medicine has a very great influence upon the acquisition of the virtues and of the knowledge of God, as well as upon the attainment of true spiritual happiness. Man acts like a human being only when he eats that. I want to try like kind of put all of the things together a little bit. Like, how are you supposed to live your life? So he says, man acts like a human being only when he eats that which is wholesome, at times avoiding the agreeable, and partaking of the disagreeable in a search for the beneficial. What he means by that is, and I don't know, I certainly wasn't successful. I'm not successful myself. I wasn't really successful teaching my kids. That's like, we don't teach our kids. No, we try to teach our kids. But in these terms, he's saying, you don't eat because it tastes good. There's something wrong with eating because it tastes good. And Rambam is actually very clear on both of those things, because he says, you're not supposed to be ascetic. Rambam is against asceticism. At the same time, but he's also not a binary. That's the nefesh achas. He says, no, it's not binaries. It's not like either this or that. It's like trying to figure out, he says, you don't eat because it tastes good. If it tastes good, good for you. And if you need to eat something and it doesn't taste good, then you have to eat that because it's beneficial. That might be medicine if you're ill, but even if you're not ill and you're healthy, it might mean, Brussels sprouts, because that's not your thing and you want to eat that. If you think about that sentence, that's like a crazy, I feel like sometimes I imagine if we actually took the Rambam, if people actually lived their lives like Rambam-like, so it wouldn't be just like, okay, well, I'm eating, sometimes like, well, I'm eating healthy because the Rambam says you should eat healthy. And I would say like, yes, but you gotta get all the steps. It's not just about eating, it's about all your dispositions, and it's not about just being healthy, it's about why you're being healthy towards what end. But on a basic level, it's like, why do I eat? And it shouldn't be because it tastes good. That's not the basic thing. We all do it. Similarly, if a man satisfies his sexual passions whenever he has the desire, regardless of good or ill effects, he acts as a brute and not as a man. The same thing is true with passions in that kind of way. There's nothing wrong with pleasure, according to the Rambam, but it can't be that that's the driving reason why you're doing everything. It is possible, however, for one to shape one's conduct entirely from the point of view of utility, as we have stated, with no aim beyond that of maintaining the health of the body or guarding them against disease. This is the line where he makes that move. He says, now that I've told you that actually you have to eat healthy, and that you can't just be in control of your passion. You can't just kind of allow your passions to run away, kind of drive everything that you do. You have to think about it and balance it. So you'll say, okay, I'm a good person because I exercise and I eat right, so I'm doing what the Rambam said. And the Rambam says that's the purpose of his 4 perfections. No, that is good, but if you're doing that, you're not understanding the whole message of what I'm trying to tell you. He says, so read the second part of the sentence, if you're doing it with no aim beyond that of maintaining the health of the body, guarding against disease. There are people who will do that only to make sure that they are healthy. Such a one does not deserve to be called virtuous. That's not virtue on its own. For just as he strives for the enjoyment of good health, another like him may have as his aim the gratification of eating or sexual intercourse, none of which action leads towards the true goal. There is a difference between enjoying your eating because that's what you want to do. You want to live your life in a way in which you enjoy your eating, and eating healthily because that's what you want to do, because there's a difference between those. But if you don't move to the next step, they're the same in that the reason why you're doing both of those is just because you want to. And what you need to do is ask a bigger question. And that bigger question is always like the challenge. Well, why am I supposed to do that? Why is that so important? The real duty of man is that in adopting whatever measures he may for his well-being and the preservation of his existence in good health, he should do so with the object of maintaining a perfect condition of the instruments of the soul, which are the limbs of the body, so that his soul may be unhampered and he may busy himself in acquiring the moral and mental virtues. Meaning, health physical health and emotional health need to be cultivated in order to become, kind of second perfection, in order to become a moral person who can interact with others in a way that's going to make the world a better place. Next perfection. That has to be in the interest of yet another perfection, which is understanding that what I'm doing because God actually told me that I should be doing it. And I want to read through some of the concrete examples, the way that the Rambam actually kind of plays them out. He says, turn back to page 2, please. I'll start at the middle of the page in the English. So his only design in eating, drinking, cohabiting, sleeping, walking, moving about, and resting should be the preservation of bodily health, while in turn the reason for the latter is that the soul and its agencies may be in sound and perfect condition, so that he may readily acquire wisdom and gain moral and intellectual virtues, all to the end that man may reach the highest goal of his endeavors. Accordingly, man will not direct his attention merely to obtain bodily enjoyment. This is a mental move. You can have the bodily enjoyment, but you have to say to yourself, that's not the end result. God created a world in which I can have this enjoyment in order for me to be able to engage in this kind of eating, health, whatever, in order for something else. Choosing of food and drink and the other things of life, only the agreeable, he won't only choose the agreeable, but will seek out the most useful, being indifferent whether it be agreeable or not. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading a lot of words. This last thing was the same, he basically is setting up the same things that he said before, which is you can't just do it because you like it. You have to do it because it's good for you. I wanted to do that to read the next paragraph because I find this also very interesting. He says, sometimes the right thing for you to do is to just do something because you like it, but the reason why that's the right thing to do is because you've actually looked at what's going on for you and you say, I actually need to do something like that right now. And he gives very contemporary-ish kinds of examples. He says, there are indeed times when the agreeable may be used from a curative point of view. As for instance, when one suffers from loss of appetite, it may be stirred up by highly seasoned delicacies and agreeable palatable foods. I wanted this one more. Similarly, one who suffers from melancholia, marash chora, may rid himself of it by listening to singing and all kinds of instrumental music, by strolling through beautiful gardens and splendid buildings, by gazing upon beautiful pictures and other things that enliven the mind and dissipate gloomy moods. I'm fascinated by this. The Rambam says, your goal in life is not to appreciate art, beautiful scenery, to listen to music and architecture. And if you think that's your goal in life because you think that's a perfection, then Rambam is very Oved Hashem oriented and says that's not the goal in life. And therefore, you have to direct yourself in a certain kind of way. However, you might make a decision that says, for myself at a certain moment, I actually need to be able to have that as part of my life in order to be able to, in his example, I'm experiencing melancholia, the person's depressed, and what's going to bring up the person's spirits is to engage in, make a decision. I want to listen to music because it's going to pick me up. I want to look at art because it's going to pick me up. There's like a ton of nuance here, and the Rambam is maybe more severe than our minds. Severe, I mean severe. Like, it's like kind of cut edges and that's it. But I actually find him to be the most, kind of complete in a kind of a remarkable way of the range of things that he's actually trying to cover. Can you imagine we say, yeah, these things are fine. Or when I was in my, whatever yeshiva I was in when I was a little kid, they'd say, these things are not fine. And again, those were the options. So now I live, then I live in a community where I said, like, all these things. The music out there, the Ram knows of Arabic music, that's what he talks about that. All those things are bad? No, we're normal, all those things are good. What the Ram is saying is, no, and no. There is a place for all of these things, and then you have to have an enormous sense of integrity in terms of engaging in this thing to try to figure out how and what way they're gonna help you. And I know that there's some kind of concern that like taking this so seriously, like when does it become, kind of OCD or compulsive and concerns and stuff like that, which I think is fair on one hand. I think but what he's actually pointing to is to force us to, part of our avodat Hashem is to actually pay attention to those kinds of things and what it's doing to us. Like, what kind of person am I becoming because I'm doing all these kinds of things? And then he goes a little further in the, which one did I want to read? Yeah, I wanted to just talk about the, hold on. Let's go back to page 3 for a second. Yeah, I'm going to do the next 2 paragraphs that we didn't yet do. Concerning those which lead, then he actually, I just like to note that he says, concerning those which lead directly to this goal, there's naturally no question, but then he talks about mathematics, conic sections, mechanics, geometry, hydraulics, and stuff like that, and saying like, when am I allowed to study those things or not? And it's a similar kind of thing. If it allows you to kind of understand, if it makes you, as an Oved Hashem, if you're making that kind of calculation, you can engage in those things as well. And I actually wanted to just get to the next paragraph too before we end, because to me it's kind of almost like a culmination of how all of these pieces come together in the Rambam, that if we were taking it really seriously, it would force us to consider, kind of the kinds of things that he says you should consider. He says, if a man has this as his ideal, and I just want to repeat that again, the ideal being perfecting your body and your temperaments in the interest of performing mitzvot to become a moral person, with an understanding that in so doing you're being Oved Hashem. If you're kind of moving in that kind of thing, that's what God wants from you, he will dispense with many of his customary deeds and refrain from a great deal of ordinary conversation. Whether the Rambam thought that shtika was a merit, what's the word I'm like? Was a virtue. Thank you. Was a virtue. To what degree? It's hard to say. So we can either say this in a way in which, like, I don't think he meant they should be silent, monk-like silence. I think we can also agree on the other extreme that sometimes we just, I don't know if we agree. I feel like we sometimes just talk too much. It's just too much talking about stuff, and that we should stop. And I would say if you were serious, you would think about that too, and you can understand how the mitzvah drive in a certain direction. And then he says, he who follows this line of conduct will not trouble himself with adorning his walls with golden ornaments, nor with decorating his garments with golden fringe, unless it be for the purpose of enlivening his soul and thus restoring it to health, or banishing sickness from it, so that it shall become clear and pure and thus be in the proper condition to acquire wisdom. What I love about this line is that the Rambam would say that the construction that you do on your house is actually an avodas Hashem question. We would never say that. We would never say something like that. And the Rambam is saying that's part of what that's the way in which Tikkun Hamidos actually connects to your personal perfection, which connects to asking why am I doing all this and being Oved Hashem. And he's given like the most this is like totally what kind of house should we build? Why are we doing it? And I'm not saying this is Musar. I'm saying this is like we live in a certain kind of society. We have if we were living Rambam-like, it would push us to ask these kinds of questions, and I think that the binariness of just to go back to the beginning part, the split between body and soul and rational and irrational and kind of the mitzvos and the averos and all of that kind of supports the idea of compartmentalizing different parts of our being in a way in which the Rambam can't accept. He says that can't be. Part of the reason why it's very hard, the Rambam in the next paragraph says, this is very, very hard. Says this is a very, very difficult thing to do, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. He also says that the people who, if you are able to do this to the max, then you are a Navi.
Then you are what?
A Navi, a prophet. That's what he says, that's what it means to be a prophet. I'll just ask you to read this for a second on page 4. The last paragraph before the guide. Now, the fact that it's very hard to achieve doesn't mean that that's not what we should shoot for. It's not like, oh, it's so hard to achieve, forget it. It's so hard to achieve. You try to do it right. We do not achieve perfection, correct. But we strive for what we think is right. And he says, know that to live according to this standard is to arrive at a very high degree of perfection, which in consequence of the difficulty of attainment, only a few, after long and continuous perseverance on the path of virtue, have succeeded in reaching. If there be found a man who has accomplished this, that is one who exerts all the faculties of his soul and directs them towards the sole ideal of comprehending God using all his powers of mind and body, be they great or small. Meaning, if somebody is able to do all of this for the attainment of that which leads directly and indirectly to virtue, I would place him in a rank not lower than that of the prophets. That's the path that he thinks you have to take in order to be able to, to become a prophet. Last thing I'm going to do, this I will close. You go back to page 2, because I just want to get a sense to read a little bit of the Rambam in Hilchos Deos. So he says, what does it mean then to be an Oved Hashem? Like, what does it mean that somebody's actually being an Oved Hashem? To be an Oved Hashem means that your mindset is such that these kinds of calculations are going on in your head with every decision that you make. That's what it means to be an Oved Hashem. What we're going to see is, again, what that means is it's not ascetic, it's not separating off from the world, it's not any of that, but it's also not just living in the world, it's actually carving out, kind of fighting the battle of getting, trying to develop these kinds of capacities all the time. At the top of the page it says, Tzarich ha'adam sheyechavein kol ma'asav kulam k'dei leidat Hashem Baruch Hu bilvad. Everything that a person is supposed to do is in order to achieve greater understanding of God. V'yeshivto v'kumo v'diburo akol umad zeh hadavar. And his sitting, his standing, his speaking, everything should be directed towards that goal. Ketzad, how does that work? Kisheyisav yitain o yasem lachal yitol sachar. This is like, how do you do that? I don't think what the Rambam says, what he's saying is not easy, but it's also, you read that first line, you say like, okay, that's not, what does that mean? That every single second you're thinking about going towards God. Then he says, Ketzad, he says, Kisheyisav yitain, when you do business, or yasem malacha, litol sachar, or you're doing work, craft, in order to earn a living, lo yeb libo kibutz mamon bilvad. You should not be doing that in order to
Make money.
the fourth perfection, make money. El yased v'rim alalu k'dei sheyimtzad v'rim shaguf tzarich lahem. If you're saying, I need this because when I have money, I know what I'm going to buy, and what I'm going to buy to eat is going to be the stuff that's actually going to make me in line with the way the Rambam thinks you're supposed to eat, then that's actually becomes part of Avodat Hashem. Me'achila v'yishtia v'yishivat bait v'nesiat isha. Having a house, eating, drinking, marriage, all that, I'm working towards that, that's Avodat Hashem. If you're doing it for certain reasons, in a certain way, with the goal of cultivating certain dispositions, and you have that goal
The end
in mind.
justifies the means.
There is a means and ends thing here, but I also, yes. V'chein ksheyochal v'yishteh v'yivol, when you're eating, drinking, and in sexual engagement too, lo yasim al libo la'asod dvarim ha'elu k'dei lehanot bilvad. I think the bilvad is very important. You don't do these things only for pleasure, and not doing it only for pleasure means that he validates the pleasure, but it can't be only for pleasure. Ad she'eino ochel v'shoteh el hamatok l'cheich v'yivol k'dei lehanot. This is what he said before in the Shmona Prakim. So that you can't just be doing that only for pleasure. El yasim al libo she'ochal v'yishteh. I'm going to stop reading because there are like a lot of words. You get basically the idea. In the last halacha, last two halachot, Yud and Yud Aleph, he says, Nimtza. You got that? Hamahalech b'derech zu kol yamav kulan. If somebody actually lives their life like this all the time, Oved et Hashem tamid. That person is an Oved Hashem all the time. Afilu b'sha'ah she'noseh v'notein, when the person is doing business. Afilu b'sha'ah she'bo'el pnei she'bo'el, even when engaged in a sexual act, b'nei she'machshavato bakol, because the purpose in every instance, in the interest of living a complete life, developing my inner personal being in a way that can serve God. Sleeping can be avodat Hashem. If you sleep till whenever, that's not avodat Hashem. If you sleep with an understanding that you need to be healthy, but if you don't sleep, that can also not be avodat Hashem, because you're just like running yourself into the ground. You need to be able to figure out how to be, and if you go to sleep and say, the reason why I'm sleeping, once you do that, I mean, my head goes to like, oh, so I get it. That's why you're supposed to get up at a certain time to daven by X hours of the day. There's like a rhythm to all of this. It's just there's sleep, you get up, there's all. So at the end of the day, the idea for the Rambam is, I'd say the Rambam is a very holistic thinker, which basically means that mitzvot and emotions and cognition and the world that's out there and avodat Hashem, all of those things are part of a structure that has to be built one on top of the other, that one doesn't achieve without lots of kind of critical thinking and deliberation around what you're doing with coaches and practice. But I find it to be a very kind of inspiring and powerful way to live, and I think one that's particularly relevant for our kind of community. I think it has a lot to say. So thanks for joining. Appreciate it.